Greetings, Saber fans. Your old pal Megtooth Sith. This video has been 89 Sabers MPP installed. Didn't show the wiring of the switch PCB or the Hillside PCB, but I've got videos on both those. I'll link those in the doobly-doo down below. The positive from the battery in this one connects to the positive of the Hillside PCB, and also ran an additional wire off the positive battery terminal. It runs back to the switch and then out of the switch to the Proffieboard. So the switch going, or the red wire going to the Proffieboard is coming out of the switch, and that's totally independent from the Hillside PCB positive. Ran two wires off the battery connector. Also, the 1-inch blade socket was a little tight on this, had to Dremel it out. So a 1-inch blade went smoothly in and out of the blade socket. Didn't show attaching the Goth 3D chassis, but I just basically milled in 832 retention screws, and that's what's holding in the Goth Padawan chassis. Used a normal Keystone holder here. Hope this video helps.
Okay,
Hope you enjoy.
So this is our KR Sabers Proffieboard V2.2, and these two pads here, this is LED pads 2 and 3. Our main blade on this MPP is going to be hooked up on these two. Now I run a single 22 gauge wire, so the only, I'm only making one connection with one wire. So what I do, since I'm only running a single 22 gauge wire, is I use a piece of resistor tail. And how I do that is I basically take the resistor and I put it up through the hole about like that, and then I'll solder it in, and then I'll show you what I do next. So I've got my resistor tail up through the hole. My soldering iron is heating up as we speak, and I'm going to clean the tip while we're waiting on the soldering iron to heat up here. And here's my iron, here's my tip, and we're coming up to temp here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pre-tin my soldering iron tip. I'm trying to do this so you guys can see. We got a little bit of solder on there. And then I'm going to move this Proffieboard around, hopefully so y'all can see, and I'm going to try not to block it with my hand, and I'm going to bring in the soldering iron, and I'm going to touch the tip to the pad, and then I'm bringing in some solder on that resistor tail, just like that. And now my resistor tail is soldered onto the pad. You inspect that. It looks like I need a little bit more solder. That didn't really bring enough solder in, so that looks better. So that's pretty good. So then what I do is I'll cut quite a bit of this resistor, and let me zoom out so you guys can see what I'm doing here. Just stand by. So I'm going to take this resistor tail that I've soldered into LED 3, and I'm going to push it up through LED 2. And this is creating my bridge between 2 and 3, and it'll be on the bottom side of the Proffieboard. There's a bunch of different ways to do this. You can just feed your wire up through there, but I like soldering the bridge. That way I know the connection touches both MOSFETs. And I'm going to zoom y'all back in here, and I'm going to make sure that we're lined up where you can see. So again, there's the solder on LED 3, and now we've got the resistor tail sticking up through LED 2, and then I'll show you the underside here when we're done, because I go ahead and do a complete solder bridge on the underside. So I'm bringing my iron in, and then I'm bringing solder to the iron, and there solder ran to the pad. And removing my iron. Nice round shiny bit of solder. Now what I normally do is, you can see our bridge here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm also going to tin the bottom of this bridge really good to receive our Neopixel negative wire. And I have a nice solid bridge across there. Worked out really good. And now we're ready to begin the install. All right, so now we're in the chassis of this MPP, and really quick I'll show you my wiring scheme. This triple bundle here, the green, white, and yellow, this is going to be my switch wires. The green is main switch, yellow is auxiliary switch, white is common ground. This red feeds my positive to my Proffieboard. This comes from the aft of the chassis from the switch, and this red feeds the switch from the positive terminal. So this is just going to be below the Proffieboard. This black, which is coming from the rear, this is our battery negative right here. The two blue wires coming through this conduit are my speaker wires. Let's see if I can pull them out, because we're definitely going to need them. Those are my speaker wires right there, the blue wires. And then this purple wire is data from my Hilt adapter. And the last wire, which we'll have to connect, is this black wire, which this is my Neopixel negative that's coming from my Neopixel adapter. So there are two black wires, both 22 gauge, but one's Neopixel negative and the other is my actual negative to the Proffieboard. So let's begin this install. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tape the wires that we don't need immediately out of the way. I know I'm going to need my speaker wires right off the bat, and I know I won't need the battery negative until the very end, or the battery positive. So I'm going to get them out of the way. So it's going to be speakers, and then auxiliary switch, and then Neopixel negative, which I'll probably solder on first, and then main switch, then battery negative, then switch ground, then positive, then is going to be Neopixel data. So that's how we're going to go around. The first wire I'm going to solder is probably going to be this LED negative, and we're going to solder that onto the merged LED pads 2 and 3 on the Proffieboard, which I already showed. Alright, so I have all wires basically out of our way except for this one. This is going to be our Neopixel negative. And when we put the soundboard in, it's going to go, about right there. It's going to leave enough slack in it. I'm going to go ahead and cut it about right there. And then I'm going to go ahead and strip just enough off of this to go to our junction. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to strip that out just like that. And now that I have that stripped, it's going to be interesting. I don't know if y'all are going to be able to see this or not. I'm going to tin this wire up, and I'm hoping that y'all are going to be able to see this, because normally when I do this solder, all the other wires are soldered in, but I'm going to try and do this one first tonight, which is opposite of what I normally do. So I've got that wire pre-tinned really good, and then I'm going to bring in our soundboard. There's a little glob of solder on the end where I tinned it. I'm going to go ahead and cut that off. And I'm going to bring in our board, and I don't know if y'all are going to be able to see this, because this is going to be really tough. I hope my fingers aren't in the way. And I'm trying to get this on camera because this is such a hard one to get on camera. Let me try and put the Saber down. Maybe y'all could get it on this angle. I don't know. We're going to give it a whirl. I still don't think y'all are going to be able to see this. I'm going to try and zoom it in here where y'all can see it. And I'm going to be attaching this wire just like that, onto our pad. I'm going to have to, this one is always the hardest solder. I'm going to try and tape the Proffieboard down on the bench here to make my life a little bit easier, and then I'll make sure y'all are still going to be in frame, because I don't want the Proffieboard moving around. And then I want to bend this wire ever so slightly up like that, so you can see the wire there going onto our merged couple. And I'm putting the wire parallel to that resistor tail that we put on the underside. This is the hardest solder on the whole Saber, to be honest with you. Everything else is gravy. And I really like the way that looks from where I'm at. Zoom in here so y'all can see that. And I'm going to try and move it so you guys can really see it. Let me try to point it out with something, but there it is. And I know that looks like there's solder elsewhere, but there's not. That's really decent. Now that black wire is shiny under my lights. That's not too much strip wire. The stripped wire actually ends right there. So it's just enough to cover the pads. I'm really happy with that. So now let's bring in my Saber holder here. Let's turn this thing around a little bit, because I want the I want it facing me. I'm going to zoom y'all out, and the Proffieboard is going to sit exactly like that. So now we're getting ready to cut our other wires. Next wires, I'm going to need speaker wires. I want to make sure that our speaker wires are tucked in there, and I'm going to stop this after this and make sure we're good. I want to leave enough slack in them. And I'll cut the seam after we get these speaker wires soldered in, and we'll get on to our next wire, which is going to be the auxiliary switch. Now my speaker wires, I run 30. I always use blue for the speakers. I don't know why I do, I just do. I've always used blue wires on the speaker. The speaker on this Saber is a Smuggler's Outpost Dark 28mm bass speaker. It's the first time I've used this speaker. I'm really hoping it works out. I'm pretty excited to hear it, especially with the fonts that I'm going to be running on this thing. Okay, so now my speaker wires are tinned. So I'm going to bring the first one up, and I'll grab it just below where it's stripped with my hemostats, and I'm bringing it up through the hole. And I'm going to bend that wire over just like that. Jeff Birch method. Hang on a minute, I'll zoom you guys in before I go and solder. Hopefully you guys will be seeing that. I'm on speaker 1. You can see there. I'm going to clean off my soldering tip here. I'm going to bring in my soldering tip on speaker 1 pad, and then I'm going to bring in some solder 1, 2, 3. Let it go. That's a good solder joint. And then I'm going to come in here. I'm going to trim the excess wire just like that. Then I'm going to grab my other speaker wire, and I'm going to come up through the hole just like I did on the other one and bend that over. And hopefully you guys can see that I'm in my other speaker hole there. And clean my tip. And we're going to come in here with the tip onto the pad. And I'm going to run solder onto the pad just like that. Golden. Now I'm going to trim that. And we're going to cut to a new scene. We're going to get to the auxiliary switch wire next. Okay, next is my auxiliary switch wire, which on a Proffie, let me zoom out here a little bit. On a Proffie 2.2, the auxiliary wire is right there. That's the auxiliary switch. The opposite side is the main switch. Now, my switch wires are this twisted pair here, and I know I need our yellow switch wire, so I'm going to take it out of that twisted triple bundle, and I'm going to retape the twisted triple bundle to keep them out of our way. I know when the Proffie is installed, it's going to be about right there, so I know I'm going to need about yay much of that wire, so I'm going to cut the rest out. Now I'm going to grab that piece of switch wire, which is going to be precarious because I've already soldered my Neopixel negative in. I'm going to zoom out here so you guys can see what I'm doing. This is 30 gauge. I use 30 on my switches as well as my speakers. And I'm going to try and strip off just enough of this to get up through the hole. And then I'm going to tin it with some solder. And then I'm going to grab it with my hemostats, and we'll take that switch wire up through the hole. And I'm going to grab it with the hemostats right below there. And I'm going to take it up through our auxiliary switch hole. And I'm going to bend it over just like that. And let's try to zoom in here and make sure you guys can see where I'm working. I know the board is kind of angled away from y'all, but that's because of the switch box on the Saber, as it were, or the clamp, the way it's sitting in my Saber holder. But that's a pretty solder there. I'm happy with that. So that's our auxiliary switch. Now I'm going to remove our clamp, and I'm going to turn the Saber around so it's facing me, so you guys will see me turning it around. And I'll try to get it hopefully where y'all may be able to see a little bit better for the next wire. So the next wire, of course, since we've already soldered our Neopixel negative onto our junction here, my next wire is going to be our green wire, which goes to our main switch. And I know when our Proffie is in its mounted position, it's going to be right there. So I'm going to trim that wire about right there. And that switch ground is kind of getting in my way. So I'm going to tape it up out of my way here. I'm going to strip off just enough to this wire to get it through the hole, not a lot, just a little bit. Just enough to get up through the hole. And we're going to tin that wire with some solder. And then I'm going to grab onto that wire with my hemostats just below where it's stripped. Click, hemostats are locked in. And I'm going to go up through this corner hole. And I'll zoom in on that here in a second and show you where we're at. So we're in the corner hole now. And let me slide the saber that way. Let's zoom in. I'm going to try and get it where you guys can see it. So we're right here. We're right here on this corner. And that is our main switch wire. And we're going to come in with our iron, clean our iron. And we're going to come onto the pad with our iron, and then we're going to bring in solder. Just like that. And that's a good joint. Next, our main negative. Now this is our main battery negative, and my main battery negative is coming from, let me back you out and show you. So my main battery negative is right here, and it's coming from this bundle from the back. And there was nowhere else in this chassis to route this main negative, but I know when the Saber is in its final install position, my main negative is going to be about right there. So I'm going to go ahead and cut her, get that piece of wire out of the way. Now I don't have a battery in here, so I'm not working with a live Saber. I know y'all see that positive wire stripped here, but there's no battery in here. You can see my finger in through there. Now this main negative is 22 gauge, so I'm going to strip her, and we're going to tin her with some solder. Now I'm not over the soundboard here, but you want to try not to tin over the top of the soundboard. And now I'm going to bring up our Neopixel negative, and once I get it up through the hole, I'll zoom you in so you guys can see where we're at. Okay, now let's zoom in here. So our main negative, this is our main battery negative, is going right here. Now if you guys notice, you guys can see on the zoom in that the negative and ground are actually touching here, and they're supposed to be. Negative and ground are common. So we could have merged this, our white ground switch wire, common ground, onto this and then sent it up into the hilt, but since we have two pads, I actually have more than two ground pads, it doesn't bother me to do those separate. And there we go. It coned up on there really nice, but I'm going to go ahead and cut that wire down to make it a little bit more low profile, and then I'm going to reflow it. And I still don't like how much that's sticking up, so bada bing. And that is good. Next wire is going to be our common switch ground, which is going right next to it. I'll do another scene there. All right, so now we're back in the MPP, and I'm going to take my common switch ground and I'm going to go through here on the inside of those, because that's where I want the wire to naturally route. And then I know that this common ground is going to go about right there. This is 30 gauge wire for my common switch ground, and I hope I didn't cut it too short, but I think it's going to be okay. And we're going to tin this wire up here. And I'm going to grab it with the hemostats. I hope I left enough slack in it. And I'll zoom in on it when we go to solder it in. Okay. It's sticking up through there. It's kind of precarious. I'm going to get some solder going here. There we go. I like how that's looking a little bit better. Let's clean that soldering kit. And we're going to come in. I need to zoom y'all in, I forgot. So we're on this pad right here. This is our common switch ground. So I'm going to bring in my iron and bring in the solder and wait for that solder to flow on that pad. Like that, nice and pretty, as you please, and away she goes. And our next to last wire is going to be our positive. Now, the danger here is that this pad is our battery positive. These pads are battery negative and switch ground, so you definitely do not want any bridging in this area. So it's very important you don't have any bridges here. And I'll check that with a multimeter to make sure. But I'm going to zoom y'all out so you guys can watch how I trim this battery positive. If it'll let me zoom out. I don't want to zoom in. I want to zoom out. There. Alright. New phone, I'm not used to it. Now I know in the final install position, our board's going to be about right there. I know that battery positive needs to be about yay long. Guys, the reason I cut these wires close is some of y'all are leaving way too much wire, and then you got a cram foo, and this is 26 gauge, by the way. And if you leave too much wire in under your board, it's too hard to get the board to sit down in its slot. So, you know, I'd try to leave just barely enough slack so I can get the wire in under there. Okay, now I'm pre-tinned there, and we're going to zoom y'all in so you can watch this happen. I'm going to grab this positive wire that we just tinned, and we're going to come up through the hole, through the positive hole just like that. And I'm going to zoom you all in a bit. Hopefully you guys can see where we're at. We're right here on the battery positive. And clean off my tip. And we're going to come in on that pad. And then we're going to add solder. And then again, there's quite a bit of wire sticking up through there, so I'm going to trim it. And then I'm going to reflow it a little bit so it looks a little bit prettier. So now we only have one wire left to go. And this is our main Neopixel data. And I know I want to feed it down through the middle because I actually want it there. And let's adjust you out so you guys can see. Basically, I just threaded our main Neopixel data wire, this purple wire, in under the center of the soundboard, because what I want is I want the Proffieboard to sit down in this holder like so. So I don't want too much wire that I have to crush down. This is our main Neopixel data, which I'm pretty sure, going from memory, it's this pad here, right here. Zoom you all in. But I'm going to go check it on the wiring diagram just to make sure, because I have all the pads memorized except that one. But I'm pretty sure this is our main Neopixel data right there, the third pad up. So let's go check and make sure. So right now I'm going to the Proffieboard webpage and I'm looking at the wiring diagram. just to make sure. Of course, I've got one on my computer. I could have just pulled it up on my computer, but what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Proffieboard V2. And data 1 is the third pad up indeed. So, since we know data 1 is the third pad up, and I know the Proffieboard installed is going to be about right there, then I know I'm going to want about yay much wire on there. And I'm going to grab that wire. Now, I'm using 26 on my main pixel data. I just use 26 because it's a little bit more stout and it's less likely to break. But you could technically use 32 gauge wire for your Neopixel data. A question often comes up, well, Proffie data 1 is pre-resistored at 330 ohms. But let's say your blade adapter has a resistor in it and your blade has a resistor in it. That means there's 3 resistors on the data line. Is that going to hurt anything? And the answer to that is no. Frederick's tested, I think, up to 10,000 ohms resistance, and data was still getting through just fine. And, you know, on Neopixel lightsabers, you know, I've been installing Sabers since Tricrease, and on Tricrease, you had to use resistors to keep from basically burning your LEDs out. So the resistors actually reduce the voltage on the hang on a minute. The resistors actually reduce the amperage going to the LED, so the LED didn't go into a LED death spiral. But on Neopixels, the resistor's purpose is to take noise out of the data line. It's not to reduce amperage to the pixel strips. Pixel strips get their power uninterrupted from LEDs 2 and 3. The data line has nothing to do with the Neopixel power. It's merely a signal telling the Neopixels what to do. All right, the last thing I'm going to do is I've got my multimeter in audible continuity test mode. And those of y'all that watch my Megtooth Mondays, you know how crazy I am about checking for, you know, shorts. So this is me probing for shorts. So the main thing I want to do is probe between negative and positive. And I'm using my continuity test mode here. So if there was a short, you would get a tone between positive and negative, which we don't. I'm going to check between the speaker pads. We do have 2.2 ohms there, which is a 2.2 ohm speaker. And let's check between Neopixel negative and positive, nothing. Neopixel data, we're good there. Jesus, Lord have mercy. Sorry, my work phone was texting the crap out of me. But at any rate, I don't have continuity where I don't expect it. So basically, what that means is now we're good to go ahead and pop a battery into this thing. And also my SD card. So I haven't had the SD card in it while we're soldering. So I'm going to go ahead and pop the SD card into our hilt. And why is that wire pulling over? I'm going to have to try and get those in a better position there. I mean, we're not putting the Proffieboard down yet. I don't understand why those wires are pulling over like that. There should be enough slack where they're fine. Okay. So I'm just checking the board's final resting position there. So anyway, let's pop a battery in here. Now, Curtis, the battery positive, the button side always goes towards the emitter. And you put the battery down on top of that, on top of the the ribbon. So you heard we got a boot. And then let's try firing it. Okay, so here we go. We're back to the MPP. I got the board taped down. We're going to give her a fire here. Let's go try lockup. Blaster block. I'm still going to have to adjust the clash sensitivity. Let's see what we got here with a blade. Let's put a blade in it. Pretty deep blade depth, but here you can see blades lit up. Awesome. So we know that the blade works. We know that the buttons work. Now I'm going to put the wires in. I'm going to actually use real wires. I'm not going to use the wires that came with it because they're kind of El Cheapo, but you know, the Hilt's pretty much done. It's installed. You know, I'll dress up the config file a little bit. And this thing has fingerprints all over it right now. Of course, I'll clean my fingerprints off it, but you know, there she blows. There's our MPP minus the wires, plus I gotta machine these two slotted screws down. One of them I'm gonna use for blade retention, and the other one I'll make sure that it's not contacting the blade when it goes in there. But you know, the Saber's done. She's all over with the crying. So bam, and I think I'm gonna do a blade building video on the rest of it.
Thank you everybody for watching as usual. I really appreciate y'all tuning in on my channel. And as always,